Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first seminar of the academic year for the Great Lakes Seminar Series. It is my pleasure today to welcome Dr. Becky Williams as our speaker. Dr. Williams is an assistant professor of interdisciplinary studies at Grand Valley State University. She teaches in multiple programs there, including environmental studies, global studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and integrated studies programs. Dr. Williams earned her PhD in interdisciplinary ecology, concentrating in tropical conservation and development from the University of Florida, and a graduate certificate in gender development. She holds an MS in instructional systems design from Florida State University and a BS in music education from Stetson University. Today, we are going to hear about her most recent research that focuses on critical hope as a key missing link in climate change resilience. So welcome, Dr. Williams.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Yeah, thank you for having me. I know that my research area is kind of a field from what you do here at Sigler and Glurl, but I think that today the presentation you're going to get is maybe the one that you need, not the one that you want, which maybe is a really good thing. So as Mary mentioned, my PhD is in interdisciplinary ecology. I tell people that I am very far on the human dimension side, and you can tell because my undergraduate was actually in music and my master's degree is in education, and so my PhD is in ecology, but I really work with communities largely on the interaction between communities, and oftentimes I find myself in a position where I'm working with people like you who are more physical or natural scientists, and collaboration as a social scientist. So I've worked on a lot of really large projects, mainly in the agricultural sector and mainly internationally, but oftentimes in collaboration with scientists who are doing more modeling and that type of research, genetic research and so on and so forth. So I'm going to talk to you today about my brand new research area, and I'll get into a little bit of the why my research has taken a dramatic shift. Like many of you, the past 9 months has been met with a lot of challenges and changes. So I will kind of talk a little bit about that. But I want to get into this idea of critical hope, and I'll tell you in a minute what that's all about. All right. It's always the which button do you push to make the slides advance? Click. Nope. Got it. Okay. Land acknowledgements. So, land acknowledgements, are one of those things that's a step towards some reconciliation, but not nearly enough. But I just want to recognize that my university sits on the land of the people of the Three Fires, and we still have a lot of work to do in terms of interacting with Indigenous peoples in respectful ways. So I'm actually going to kind of tell you a story today, more than I'm going to give you data. So a couple years ago, fall of 2024, almost a year ago, I was tasked with teaching a class called Wicked Problems of Sustainability. Wicked problems being intractable, extremely difficult to solve problems. When you try to solve them, sometimes they can actually backlash, or they can be unintended consequences. And so essentially, my department gave me a class on unsolvable environmental problems and told me to then go teach undergraduates about these unsolvable problems in our program. And so I was really kind of stuck with, like, how do I do this without just profoundly depressing every single student in my classroom? And so I started doing a lot of reading around ideas of things like hope. Actually, before that ended up happening, I was looking up some sea level rise data to verify some numbers that I was using for a presentation. And the numbers that I were looking at were saying that sea level rise was on the worst case pathway in terms of the RCPs. And I was kind of surprised by that because I hadn't heard that that was the case. And so I wanted to just verify that I was actually correct in the information that I had. And so I did what any of us would do. I went and read the IPCC report from 2023, which threw me into a complete and total depression. So, for 15 years, I've been working, like many of you, on climate mitigation, climate adaptation, doing a lot of work with communities in developing countries. And that's really what my research and my work is focused on for all of these years. And so when I read this report, it absolutely took the wind out of my sails. I mean, it was like a gut punch. And the researchers and especially the committee chairs, they did not pull their punches. They did not hold back in this report. At one point, they actually said, by the writing of the next report, it will be too late to walk back what, the tipping points that we're going to reach. And so now I found myself in a position where not only am I having to teach a class on unsolvable problems, environmental problems, but I'm also having trouble even going to work. I really did hit like a full clinical depression where it was hard for me to get out of bed, the whole thing. I did actually start seeing a therapist at this time because I just was like, I don't know what to do at this point. Like it just feels like now I should just kind of give up. So that's when I started really reading, as any good academic does, about hope. Like, trying to find something to hold on to that gave me any sense of hope for the future, and hope as a researcher or an educator working with young people. And I'm trying to, train these young people to go into these careers that we are in without making them just fall apart. Well, it turns out that my students were kind of in the exact same place that I was. And so at the beginning of the semester, I do a lot of community building in my classroom. This is one of my classes where I just said, the prompt was literally, how are you doing in terms of like your thoughts on the climate changing? And as you notice, every single group drew a world on fire. In every single one of these pictures, there's at least one world on fire. And I was just like, whoa, okay, the kids are not okay. And this is something that I have seen repeatedly across my classes. And of course, we talk about it a little bit here and there, but it's not something that we actually focus on a lot in the classroom is in terms of how people are actually doing. And so I saw this and I was really distraught. So I started really digging into the research on this. And there's a whole lexicon of words that have popped up around climate emotions, eco-anxiety, climate anxiety, environmental distress, climate change distress, eco-angst, solastalgia, all of which kind of been wrapped up in the term psychoterratic syndromes. So these are mental health syndromes essentially that are based off of people's experiences of a rapidly changing world and the consequences of that. Most of these syndromes still fall under generalized anxiety disorder or major depressive disorders. So the psychological field doesn't see these as being distinctive from other areas yet, but there is a lot of talk about this. So I started looking up the research on my students, and I found, I basically scoured the literature on this. I mean, very in-depth literature review. I found every article I could possibly find on climate emotions. And this one study with 16,000 plus participants all across the United States, young people aged 16 to 25, and you can see that they are 85% at least say that they are actually worried on a daily basis. So nearly every young person is actually really worried about what's happening with the climate, and to the point where nearly half of them say that it actually has an impact on their mental health daily. Another study that looks at across 10 countries found almost the exact same thing in terms of how young people are doing. In the classroom, we're not addressing this issue at all. And some of the reasons that the research state is, basically flat out avoidance on the part of instructors, a mindset that we should be restricted to only talking about positive emotions. And you might even experience that here and in your own work, where nobody wants to hear the doom and gloom. Everybody wants to focus on the one good thing that's happening or whatever good news you can possibly find. People are restricting their own emotions. In the classroom, instructors don't necessarily want to be vulnerable in terms of how they are actually doing. And what we're also finding is that faculty and instructors are having difficulty themselves, right? So maybe some of you are as well. So I love this quote: students are unable to engage with the uncomfortable emotions associated with current environmental realities, or to harness the potential of negative emotions for generating the required radical change. So essentially, we are not teaching young people how to sustain themselves in this, what is now a lifelong fight in terms of mitigating. I mean, we're really past mitigation, but adapting to climate change and the consequences that are going to come with that. So I also ended up looking at the research on researchers, and surprisingly to me, there was very, very little research conducted on how those of us that are working in climate and related fields are doing emotionally about the climate crisis. I only found maybe 10 papers total after weeks of scouring the internet. But this one in particular really resonated with me because it was focused specifically on IPCC researchers. So they had a 40% response rate, which is pretty decent. And 60% of the IPCC researchers are experiencing climate anxiety, and 88% expect catastrophic impacts of climate change in their lifetime. And I was also really surprised to see that 60% expected 3 degrees Celsius of warming by 2100. So the IPCC researchers themselves are not feeling good about the situation. I love this quote too. Climate researchers now also bear the burden of foresight, of seeing what losses and challenges lie ahead, and the curse of knowing that these could have been avoided. And this is one of the things that as an entire field, we are really not talking a lot about. The fact that, especially with the release of the 2023 reports, researchers as well as educators, people, activists, NGOs, people that are working in this sector are not only having to do the work that we're doing in very complicated circumstances right now, but also at the same time knowing that we are going to experience massive loss. We're going to experience loss of species. We're going to experience loss of biodiversity. We're going to see cultures that are lost, entire islands, nations that we know now, at least with the current predictions, that unless we make drastic changes very, very quickly, which does not look like that's going to be happening, that this is what's going to happen. So one thing that I, in my own work, want to challenge is this idea of ideological neutrality in the work that we do. This is a philosophical conversation I'm sure you had when you were in your programs, respective programs. But there's this mentality that those of us that do, especially natural sciences and physical sciences type of research, that you have to be neutral and objective. Because of that, scientists largely have not engaged in climate activism or other types of climate action. Because the perception is that if you do, then it's going to then bias your research, or you're going to be perceived as a researcher that then has bias. Now, there's an argument against that. Largely, what I would say with what's happening, what's currently happening in the United States and globally in terms of people walking back climate goals, of exiting the scene in terms of research and support for climate work, that now is the time that scientists need to think about the fact that we are the frontline people when it comes to actually talking about this crisis. And right now, scientists largely are only doing that through their academic papers, through presentations at conferences and things like that, and not actually engaging with the public. So this results in a couple of different coping mechanisms. And some of you probably can identify with these. Protected distancing. I go to work, I do my work. When I leave work at home, and then I don't engage with it when I get home as a mechanism of protecting yourself from the emotional impacts of the actual work that you're doing. Eco-paralysis is actually like that freeze response where maybe you are doing the research, but any type of action, you're not sure what to do, where to start, where to make changes in your own life, and you get that freeze of there's nothing that I can do, I would just recycle, right? which is a funny thing in and of itself. Flat out and avoidance, compartmentalization, loss of engagement, and then full-on inaction. So I came across this book, Critical Hope, by a professor from the University of British Columbia, Dr. Kari Grain. This book completely pulled me out of my depression. And the way that it did that is because it brings together the dominant wisdom from many different fields, including education, social sciences, anti-racism studies, anti-colonial studies, decolonial studies, gender studies, all these different spheres that for me, I had been introduced to in my studies, and it brought them all together in one place where it looks at the word hope as a completely different thing than what we normally think of it as. It's grounded in critical thought, and it was introduced by Paulo Freire, which if you have heard of Paulo Freire, he wrote the book Pedagogy of the Oppressed. He was responsible for teaching tens of thousands of non-literate community members in Bolivia how to read in a very quick amount of time. He did it so well that he was actually kicked out of the country for it because he was empowering the poorest class and did so too well. So Paulo Freire's is basically where this information comes from. But critical hope is not just hope. It's a politically conscious, action-driven practice that resists passive optimism. It's grounded in community engagement and oriented toward this transformation of structural injustice through imagination, dialogue, and sustained collective effort. So what does that actually mean? All right, so I'm going to have some formatting issues, I guess, from switching over, but that's okay. So what happens when you don't use downloaded fonts? In any case, so I'm going to go through the principles really quickly. So the book is broken into 7 principles of critical hope. The first one is hope is necessary and hope alone is not enough. So this is where I was when I came into this research. I had hope that we were going to be able to, solve these issues, and then I hit that wall where I realized that that is not actually what the data say. And it's not what the trends are, and it's not what the political motivations are. And so just hoping is actually quite problematic. That's basically just sitting around and saying, like, oh, we'll probably fix it, and then hopefully everything will be okay in the future. So while it's important to have some hope or to find those areas that give you hope, that's just simply not enough to sustain over the course of your careers and your lifetimes. So critical hope is actually not something that you have, it is something you practice. And this is one of the most important parts of the book. It really gets into this idea of a praxis, which is both action as well as self-reflection. And so it's a very purposeful form of action that kind of interrogates your own space, your own role in society. And so basically saying you have to get involved. Now, what does involvement look like? It really depends. One of the things that she talks about in the book is to practice your parts, practice your art, and practice asking questions about the system. And so practicing your part, I consider my work as a researcher and educator is practicing my parts, right? That is what I am doing towards trying to solve these issues. And practicing my art, for me, I would say that what my art really is probably teaching, more so than research. I love research. But being in the classroom with young people and seeing that aha moment is, I would say, was something that I'm particularly good at. That's my art. And practicing asking questions of the system is not very hard right now. There's a lot of questions to be asked. So the third principle is critical hope is messy, uncomfortable, and full of contradictions. So this is the idea that just because you get involved, just because you start taking action, it doesn't mean that it's not going to be ugly, right? And what that looks like may wildly depends. For example, if you get engaged with minoritized or marginalized communities and you are a person with privilege, how do you enter into those spaces in ways that are actually respectful? We were having that conversation this morning about how to involve Indigenous peoples in some of the work that's done here and do that in a way that's respectful of these communities and the historical legacy of the fact that those communities have been marginalized and abused by the dominant culture, right? Critical hope is intimately entangled with the body and the land. So I myself, my training is largely internationally focused, international development. All of my research and work has been with USAID, which I'll talk about in a minute. And so I kind of was called career-wise to look more globally, to look internationally in my own work. But more recently, I've realized that the research in terms of how we are going to move through the climate crisis is largely looking at communities and reestablishment of community-based everything, community-based energy, community-based agriculture, reestablishing these relationships that in the United States, at least, we have really lost on a larger scale. Critical hope requires bearing witness to social and historical trauma. Essentially, the way that I look at this particular critical hope is that there have been, the predominant wisdom is that the climate crisis is the biggest crisis that has hit our planet because it is a planetary wide phenomenon. But the truth of the matter is that there have been cultures and communities and peoples throughout history that have had to experience and had to figure out how to survive through extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So those lessons of wisdom actually paint a pathway forward in terms of what we're experiencing now. So centering those stories and those processes and ways of going about things and ways of thinking from those different communities, centering those is actually essential in terms of moving through the climate crisis and not necessarily the dominant Western way of thinking, right? So we're talking also about Indigenous thinking and so on. Right now, I would say that bearing witness is actually probably one of the most important things that we can do. Bearing witness is not actually a passive thing. So for example, my work with USAID is now all gone, right? So 15 years of research is all vanished in terms of all of our reports, all the databases, all of it is gone. Yeah, it's super depressing. But at the same time, I still have all of that data, right? And I have that data in a secure location. It is information, it is data, there are papers that can be brought back into the conversation or be used as evidence of what was happening at the time that we have been started experiencing these large disruptions to the type of work we're doing. So bearing witness can actually look like a lot of different things. And I would say that's particularly relevant here in terms of what you have had to change or censor or be cautious about in your own work. Keeping track of those things, keeping that story and writing that down is a form of bearing witness of what we are actually experiencing right now. Critical hope requires interruptions and invitations. Essentially, you know, this is a situation where all of us in the room have probably tried to convince our mom that climate change is real and have really had a hard time with that. You know, it's kind of that idea of inviting people into the conversation and then allowing those interruptions to happen as a way to then educate or have these difficult conversations. Anger and grief have a seat at the table is probably my favorite. So this is like where we come back to the emotional side of things and the fact that people in our field are not processing the reality of the emotions that we're experiencing around our work and around knowing what is coming in the future. That is resulting in a lot of different issues, including mental health issues, burnout, all of these different things that some of you may be experiencing in real time. So I took all of this and I applied it to that class I was telling you about. I signed the Critical Hope book. I designed the entire class out of those principles, as well as the book on systems thinking, because systems thinking is actually a really important component of Critical Hope, being able to see how these structures are connected and how you can enter into them to actually affect change is really important. So some of the things that my students said, and I'll just read the green parts for time, but actually this one is so great. I feel like the words hope and future contradict each other. Having real genuine hope for the future of the world seems impossible without being ignorant or misinformed, because last I checked, we've been nonstop causing incomprehensible damage to our planet since the dawn of civilization. So much so that we are well past the point of no return in terms of permanent damage to the natural world. So that was from one of my student essays at the beginning of the semester. And every single essay was just like that. This one, in terms of thinking about hopelessness, the cycle of hopelessness, something happens and makes me feel like I'm hopeful. And then I think about all the work that has to be done and I lose hope again. And that cycle persists. So what we ended up doing, these ugly slides, but that's okay. What we ended up doing is focusing the class on a semester project where they had to get involved. So students actually had to go join a group, join some type of action, get out there, get their hands dirty, whether it be protesting or growing a community garden, whatever it was, they had to get involved. They also had to participate in mental health coping strategies. They got to choose what they did, but they had to do it every single week for a certain amount of time over the course of the semester and then self-reflect on that. Now, the interesting thing about that was that I had several students tell me that it was the first time in their entire life that they had ever taken the time to actually work on their mental health. And I was actually really surprised by that. Yeah. In terms of some of these other ones, we did a lot of field trips because in terms of localizing the actual climate issues and how they're affecting the Grand Rapids area. So we looked at global and also like marginalized peoples in terms of these larger case studies that are really explaining the issues that are occurring, but then localize that within our own community. And so through that, my students actually did an in-depth analysis of a food system at Grand Valley State. And I chose that particular one because I knew they were going to run into some things that would make them very, very angry. One of them being that our food producer, or where we get our food from at GVSU, is Aramark. Aramark, the corporation, uses prison labor. And so I knew my students were going to discover that and that it was going to make them really mad, as well as other things like we pay international students less than we pay other students. They're also only allowed to work on campus. We pay them, I think, an average of $9 an hour, which is below what the actual minimum wage is, and many other issues that are embedded in our food system. And that as a model for what we were actually seeing on a much grander scale. And so the students got together stakeholders, they did stakeholder interviews, they brought stakeholders together. We really dug into the different problems. We had management from the university as well as students to really dig into the issue. And at the end of the day, our upper vice presidents and so on, our upper administration at the university basically thinks that there is not a food security problem on our campus. And that's what they have repeatedly told our food bank, for example. There's no food security problem on campus. Now, 70% of GVSU students are first time in any college students. So we are drawing specifically from communities that are marginalized and communities that students are going to be the first person in their entire family to ever go to college. And so the logic that there's no food security problem is not very good logic. So this semester, I'm teaching the class again, and my students are doing a university-wide survey to prove that we actually do have a food security problem on campus and that we need to give our food bank money. So our food bank at university gets $500 a year, right? And so I am on a mission to do something about that. At the end of the semester, the students were completely transformed. I was actually shocked. I mean, it was an experiment, and in an experiment, 20 out of 20 students described in their essays a transformation in their view of what hope is and how they could actually enact hope in their own lives, and especially for the sustainment over their careers. So this student saying, I did not know what the alternative was. I've learned that it's okay to feel anger, right? It's okay to be mad and upset about the reality of the situation that we are in. And students also talked about the need for humility, action, uncertainty, and optimism. So getting 20-year-old college students to be comfortable with uncertainty is certainly a phenomenon. And then acknowledging the uncomfortable reality of the system while still finding the motivation and courage to work towards a solution. And this one as well, importance of self-awareness and maintaining critical hope. Setbacks are inevitable, and to view them as opportunities for reflection and growth rather than reasons to disengage. These experiences underscore that critical hope isn't just about believing in better outcomes, but actively working toward them through collaboration and sustained effort. So it actually went so well that I ended up writing an entire research article on it and published it in Sustainability, and it went through fast. And what I realized is that it was the first time I've ever gotten a review back where from 4 reviewers, where all 4 reviews were super positive. And I was like, well, I can just quit my job now, because I had finally had that moment where the reviewers were like, I love this paper. But really what that said to me is that this is a topic that is just not being talked about. And like I said, I scoured the literature and I could hardly find anything on this topic. So I put an article out. I actually reached out to the author of the book, Kari Grain. She and I struck up a friendship, flew to Vancouver, wrote the article with her over a few days, came back, we published it, and now we are doing more research together, which I'll get to next. So my research was all kind of these types of things. International development, largely around women's empowerment, largely in terms of how climate change is driving issues around rural livelihoods. So the biggest project that I did was by myself was a $250,000 project looking at how to reduce human migration out of Central America, irregular migration. So I was looking at how climate change was influencing rural livelihoods and how the options for people became stay and live in poverty, migrate irregularly without papers to the United States, or join a gang or narco traffickers, right? And those are basically the 3 options that you have in rural communities in Honduras. That study was funded by USAID, and out of it came a lot of suggestions on how to address the migration crisis out of Central America. A lot of money was allocated towards that, and obviously now there is not. So, like many of you, all my research, like I said, was wiped out. Which then threw me into another spiral in terms of, now what do I do? All of my research for all of 15 years of my career, I mean, like however much money that I've had over the years, around a couple $1 million, all of it was USAID money. And so I've then found myself kind of stuck. So in conversations with some colleagues about this critical hope stuff, which I was really sharing out of a concern for everybody, that we were kind of in this shared space of grief and anger that we're not processing. And after talking to my colleagues at various different universities, we all started to realize together that what they are seeing in their work on the ground with communities is exactly what I was talking about with the critical hope work at the community level. So when we talk about climate resilience, oftentimes what we're actually looking at is things like, I'll go to this one. This is quite relevant for all of you in terms of agents and systems and institutions, in terms of like developing technologies and getting people to adopt technologies that will help them make better informed decisions. That's part of resilience. Having strong communities and strong social networks within communities is a big part of resilience. But what we were finding in our discussions through our own research is that there's a key missing piece here, and that is the psychological aspects of resilience. So when I started talking with my colleagues, they're going into communities and they're doing climate resilience work. And while these other things are important, the number one thing that they are seeing that makes a community resilient is actually a sense of hope. And that was really surprising. And so when I started talking to them, like, well, what do you mean by hope? What do they mean by hope? What we were getting into was actually some of the principles of critical hope were the exact same things that the communities were actually telling us. So I started digging into that, and I only found these few papers in terms of application of psychological dimensions to community resilience in the face of climate change. There's tons of stuff out there on how young people are doing emotionally. There's a lot of stuff out there on the rise of eco-anxiety and all the emotions around it, but there was very little research that actually applies that to the context of climate change resilience. So I started looking at the different frameworks that were out there. And there's many, many, many of them. I just selected a few of them. And as you can see, none of these are going to say anything about hope or community resilience, especially in the psychological aspects. So even over here, this is a lovely one that has a technological on one side and kind of community resilience on the other side. And it says nothing. It's all about resourcefulness, right? Of redundancies, decision-making, and so on. Here's another one where this one I thought was really interesting because there is nothing in here except for the very tangible things like soil and water inputs and the very technological aspect of resilience. And there's nothing in here really about the community stability and community like psychological in how they're doing. Similar with this one. This one's focused on Europe. Again, it has all these different areas. It does have health, but when I dig into the article, what they're talking about is physical health, right? Not other forms of health. This is actually out of the IPCC's report. And this is one of their frameworks for resilient development pathways. And it has a lot of great stuff in here in terms of like gender equality, diversity, indigenous knowledge, but again, nothing around this other part that myself and my colleagues are seeing in our research, that there's this missing aspect of a community that actually has hope. And again, this is another one from the IPCC reports focused on health building blocks. And again, like the same thing, we don't see anything around these topics. So I am just now starting to go through ethical review processes, and there's a couple of different areas of research that my colleagues and I are going into. One is we're going to start doing research on researchers themselves to see how actual researchers are doing psychologically in terms of their work and their ability to sustain that in the long term. The other thing that we are working on is we're going after funding to go into communities that we know are adapting or are showing evidence of being resilient in the face of massive climate change, to see if the principles of critical hope actually hold up when you put them against the community and resilience frameworks. So we'll still look at things like community cohesion and solidarity and things like that. We'll still look at social networks and stocks and all of that stuff. But at the same time, we also want to see, is there a psychological component and a community-based component of hope that is required for people to actually sustain themselves in terms of this long-term fight. So these are some of the books that I've read. There's many more. If you would like some more examples, I'm happy to give them to you. But all of them really dig into this particular topic and are positioning this as a key missing piece. I'm actually participating in a 12-week training right now through a group called the Good Grief Network that focuses on STEM professionals and climate change and how to actually create processes where we can come together, talk about these issues, and talk about the actual grief and anger that we're experiencing in such a way that allows us to continue to move forward. So like I said, I'm really just now kind of getting into it. Everything has changed for me since January. And so now all of my research is moving over into this other area, which also hopefully will be able to be funded to do it by outside of the federal system, is what we're hoping. So I'll stop there. I know that that's probably an unusual presentation for all of you, but I hope that it stirred up something. And if we've got some time for questions. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for your presentation. It was wonderful. Thank you. And I wanted to ask a question about the Critical Hope Principle 6.
Yeah.
Specifically, I've had a lot of discussions inside and outside of work on whether or not people with the knowledge and the privilege to be in certain spaces with folks who don't believe in climate change, don't believe, the severity of the impact that we have, and, don't believe the research that we do every day and that we're employed to do, like that we have a responsibility to have these critical conversations, and that and then there's another side of wanting to just cut off those connections and cut off those relationships and try to punish their way into belief. And so I was hoping you could talk about whether or not your books, the books that you mentioned, or your research or your class kind of explored this idea, and whether or not that's an effective way to instigate change. And yeah, whether or not you support this, or if anything you found contradicts this. But
yeah, I know it's interesting. It's a really interesting question. In terms of the books that I've read, I feel like a lot of the people that have written these books are positioning themselves from the perspective that there is an other side that doesn't want to engage with this conversation. Not all of them do, but a lot of the books actually do kind of come from that perspective. And I think it's because they are either climate scientists or they are in related fields. So they're feeling that pressure, or that frustration of having these conversations and being seen kind of as the villain in this conversation. With that said, I also am of the mindset that we have a responsibility to enter into those conversations, which is why I want to push against the notion that we have to remain ideologically neutral as scientists. People don't trust scientists anymore. They don't trust academia anymore. Now, a lot of that is obviously propaganda, but some of it is also that we are not visible in the regular community. When we are, it's a pundit on a news show that has an agenda of some type, rather than actually getting out into a community, engaging directly with them and answering the hard questions, engaging in actually the hard conversations. I think the challenge is that we're not trained in that, right? And there is a whole suite of training around critical conversations that people, I think, we need to engage in to be able to effectively enter into those communities and have those kinds of conversations. But what I think is better than going into a space that is all from a point of climate change denial is to mix the groups together. And from my personal viewpoint, one of the reasons that we've gotten to where we at is that we have created these divisions, and that we keep reinforcing them through things like cutting everybody out of our lives that doesn't agree with these particular things, or vilifying people who have these beliefs or viewpoints that are likely coming from sources that are not credible, right? And so the only way that you can actually get past that is to actually get in a room and have conversations. So that the training that I'm actually participating in, that's one of the goals of it, is to be able to hold civic conversations around these issues, to bring people together in order to, one, humanize scientists, humanize the people that are actually working around climate change and in the climate change sphere, and do that in such a way that people who may be very protective of their family, for example, which is oftentimes where this mentality comes from. I need to protect me, my family, my people first. Why do I care about all these other people and all of the things that I can't necessarily see, right? That mindset has to be disrupted, right? So to me, it's what I would like to see is a much larger effort towards engagement with communities, with the willingness to have these really hard conversations. And knowing that you may not necessarily change everybody's minds, but sometimes just planting that initial seed will then lead to people questioning other things. So one of the big points was question the system, right? So how can we get people to then question the system that is giving them bad information or that is vilifying scientists, and why has that actually become a pervasive viewpoint? Do you have a follow-up? It looks like you had like a, yeah.
If it's okay, thank you. Follow-up question, and I'm glad that you're moving this research towards asking researchers about their
Yes.
experiences, because I think in my experience working in publicly funded research or grants and projects is that it's not a lack of willingness necessarily, but it's a burnout.
Yes.
It's, now we're being expected to need to support and justify our work to those who are funding us. Of course, I think that's always been there. And now we're adding community engagement and trying to engage the public at work. And so then bringing that home, I think that's overwhelming. And how to build resilience and the ability to do that good work without getting overwhelming, I think will be like really important. And I'm glad you're doing that.
Yeah,
So
and to
more of
me,
a comment than a
that's-
question, I suppose. But
No, it's more of a comment, but it kind of reinforces kind of what I'm trying to say, is that this idea of critical hope, I think is absolutely fundamental for all of us to be able to continue doing the work that we're doing. The evidence shows that there's massive amounts of burnout among climate scientists and researchers and educators. Students who enter into environmental fields already have a much higher level of anxiety around these issues than students in other majors. So even coming into people who are graduating and coming into fields like these are already feeling that high level of pressure and stress. It's just not sustainable over the course of an entire career. Plus, on top of all of the other societal and issues that are putting additional pressures on our ability to sustain ourselves. So in my mindset, we need to have quite a bit more training in spaces where we can actually get together and have these conversations. I would imagine that, my guess would be that none of you have ever sat together with other people and actually discussed how you're doing in terms of climate change, in terms of like this knowledge that we are going to face these massive losses. I'm a fairly sensitive person, and so I definitely am like thinking about like what I know is coming. I know there's going to be war. I know there's going to be massive loss of life. I know that there's going to be civil war. These things are going to happen, right? We can pretend like they're not going to happen because right now it makes us feel better and gets us through the day, but it's not going to sustain over the long term in terms of what happens when things do get really tough. And things are getting tougher, and they're going to continue to get tougher. All of the evidence is pointing to tipping points. So how do we then persevere over the long term and see ourselves in an indigenous wisdom type of mentality? They talk about 7 generations thinking, right? So the 3 generations before you, your generation, and the next 3 generations. And part of the thing that we need to think about is the fact that this is going to be 100 years or 200 years of efforts. And so we are one piece of this much larger chain that has to occur. So how do we actually keep that healthy without going home and just completely compartmentalizing, or going home and getting in a fight with your spouse because you're stressed out, because your funding's under threat, and because you're being told by your neighbor that climate change isn't real, or that there's a presentation to the United Nations that it's not real, right? Things like that. And that's, for me, that's incredibly demoralizing myself. And so this idea of cultivating a praxis of hope, of actually getting engaged in mental health work, of having conversations around the actual emotional impacts of this work, and then getting involved in something that can make you feel like you're contributing locally, right? So a lot of us, the work that we do is spreads out, right? It goes out to other parts of Michigan or across the United States or whatever the case may be. But in terms of sustaining ourselves, it's really important to get involved locally so that you can actually see a tangible effect of the work that you're doing. And I think that, I know Ayumi and I were briefly talking about her work, and we were talking about like, the challenge of figuring out how people are using your tools, and if it's actually meeting the need that they have, how they're using it, and so on and so forth. And I would say that this is a very similar, it's a very similar mindset of trying to figure out I just kind of lost my train of thought on that, but essentially of trying to figure out the processes that need to be put in place for you to be able to sustain yourselves, right? And so, like I say, like this is I find that this is a conversation that can make people really uncomfortable, but what I have noticed is that this is a pervasive problem that's really impacting the emotional health of the people who are working in this field, especially now. And I have no way of knowing if there's any questions from, oh, right on, cool. Oh, I love articles. Yes. Oh, I also should note in terms of that, Kari and I, the author of Critical Hope, we are currently working on an article where we are positioning Critical Hope as a key component of climate resilience in an effort to push back against, again, this idea of ideological neutrality. So we'll probably try to put it in sustainability as well, because they're pretty friendly to what we've been doing. But I anticipate that that's going to be a more controversial article.
Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. So going back to your student surveys,
Yeah.
I'm curious if your students ever kind of went into detail on climate policy in terms of how climate policy influences kind of where we are. And, you know, because I know a lot of what you pointed out was really on the emotional side.
Yes.
And, you know, focused on hope. But, you know, as we unpack things, I'm curious if you know, had any, you know, really insightful pieces on that topic.
I don't know if I have anything particularly insightful other than to say that we do go pretty deeply into policy. That is one of the areas I think that frustrates my students the most, because of the fact that we have international agreements, you know, put into place that are not being recognized, or they're not being followed through upon. So you look at the pledges that were made in the Paris agreements, and you know, the countries that are actually producing the most amount of carbon in the atmosphere are nowhere close to meeting their actual target goals. Even the United Kingdom, which has done a lot of work, I think they're about 40% renewable energies, even they have walked back their goals. And so what my students are seeing when they look at international policy is policy that is agreements and policy that are there that everybody's ignoring. And the US-based system, we are in a period of time where we are seeing all of the policies that have been put in place being taken back. And so the conversation in class will often go like, here we're looking at policy around pipelines, and we're looking at these case studies around pipelines and so on and so forth. And here's what EPA and EGLE and all these different organizations have in terms of laws and policies. And then at the end of the class period, essentially what I tell them is that's all gone now, right? And so like, while we do get into policy, that is definitely not an area that I have successfully figured out how to navigate positively. Yeah, largely it's just a massive source of frustration for them. So I have absolutely nothing good to offer you on that, except for that's what's happening in the classroom. And I will say though, I also do have several students who are going into environmental policy and law from GV into usually Michigan State or University of Michigan. And you know, it's very interesting because when they're applying for graduate school, they're having a lot of conversations with existing people working in environmental policy and environmental law. And they are all telling my students not to go down that route, to just choose something else. And so my sense is that all the stuff I'm talking about here in the policy field is probably even more relevant than it is for us, because that is right out of the mouths of environmental lawyers and environmental policymakers who are telling my students don't do it. Yeah, which is really interesting. And even the person that helped me with the facilitation in February is now doing environmental justice master's degree here at University of Michigan. So this stuff is resonating with them, but the policy area is pretty tricky. Yeah.
Well, first, thank you for that. That was fantastic. And I was wondering if in your research, your reading, has the question of the role of like art, broadly speaking, come up in facilitating hope and maybe even critical hope and kind of laying the foundation for that? Just because that practice probably is easier if we can imagine where we're going, and art is sometimes a really good way to help us imagine where we need to go.
Very much so. It's very much centered in the Critical Hope book as well as other literature that I've read. And part of that is like, if we go back to the idea of censoring the stories of historical, trauma and things like that, the way that a lot of marginalized groups have been able to sustain themselves over the long term has been through art and music and dance. And so I use the example with my students that when you look at the Black Panther movement, they had a high rate of suicide at one point in time because, and this is actually a pervasive problem in the climate change sphere as well, that people feel like they have to constantly be on, constantly be doing, to be moving forward, to be fixing, to, there's no sense of being able to rest. But what they ended up doing when they started having these big mental health issues within the Black Panthers, they all started doing yoga together. Right. And so, that's really interesting. So it was a mindfulness and physicality thing, but it was also like a community building. It was also caring for mental health, and it had a substantial impact on that movement. So I would say this it's a very similar thing in terms of working on mental health doesn't always mean going to a therapist, right? Working on mental health can be getting engaged in art and music and dance, but those are absolutely central, not only to build our own mental health, but also as messaging, right? So we were talking a little bit about like, how do you actually interact with the public? Well, the arts are one of the ways that you can be, I think, most successful in actually engaging with the public. So yeah, it's absolutely central to this idea of critical hope. And that looks different for different people, right? Some of you may be proper artists. I doodle, which when I did my critical hope project with my students and I asked them to work on mental health, I did it with them. So I started doing this called Zen doodling, where it's basically just like mindless, but makes really pretty pictures. And so I would take them in and I'd share it with them so they could see, like, I'm asking you to do this, but I'm also doing it myself. And that was, for me, I chose art as my mechanism to work on mental health. The students chose all kinds of other things. I even had one do Pokemon Go. And I was like, all right, it's getting you outside. And then the Pokemon Go ended up being like, he was like, this is the best thing that's ever happened. I do Pokemon Go, and then suddenly I can write my paper. And I'm like, yeah, it's called cognitive load, bud. Like, you need to take a break.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, sorry, great talk. So it's a little switch, but first off, I'm sorry about your AID stuff.
Thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, I'm glad that you have materials with you and you have substance. So hopefully we'll find a way out again.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. So it was very eye-opening to hear that the psychology aspect being a gap, and even half-baked idea is okay, but I'm wondering what kind of hypotheses that might be helpful to address, identify a way for sustainability.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that you allowed me to have half-baked ideas on that. Yeah, that's actually kind of what we're currently working on. And so in terms of looking at the emotional state of researchers, my viewpoint on that is that we are seeing a lot of exiting of the field or exiting of certain positions because of the emotional impact on that work. I'm also really interested in seeing how that is affecting their lives outside of work. And so the question there in terms of hypotheses would be how it is affecting, how the pressures from the work and also the knowledge of the coming impacts of climate change are affecting people's emotional state, and then how that relates to their ability to actually do their job. And then also their personal relationships and things like that. So my hypothesis is essentially that climate researchers are in a state of crisis. And that state of crisis is directly related to the work that we're doing, as well as the lack of movement towards actually addressing the global climate crisis on a global scale, right? And so that goes back to that quote of knowing that these things could have been avoided, and now knowing that they're coming, and the emotional toll that that takes. In terms of the work on climate resilience, we are hypothesizing that communities that have developed a culture of hope, and we are saying a critical sense of hope. So communities that have active engagement, that are in some ways able to use culture or other like the arts and so on, to bolster the community in terms of cohesion, in terms of their abilities to collaborate, their abilities to plan. We are hypothesizing that this critical aspect of hope is integral to that process, and that without that being there, that communities are essentially less resilient, regardless of if they have, essential stocks, money saved or whatever, or disaster preparedness plans and so that. There is some evidence to actually support that in the literature in terms of how people react to crisis and the connection to those strong relationships in managing crisis, acute crisis. What we want to look at is how the slow crisis is affecting, whether or not that critical piece of hope is helping people to address the slow crisis, which is a much harder thing to determine, and we got a lot of work to do to figure out how to do that. Because the psychometric indicators or the psychometric bodies of questions are not sufficient to the task just yet. And there's even a lot of debate in the literature as to which measure is accurately capturing XYZ emotional states. But the research does show pretty soundly that there are certain emotions that lead to inaction, and there are other emotions that lead to action. And so we kind of want to get a sense of how that works at the community level, right? Communities that like people or communities that have a high level of fear, that have a high level of dismay, are much less likely to take action than communities that are angry. So anger is actually a very useful tool in activism. Yeah. So we want to see if that actually holds up. Yeah. We could be totally wrong, but qualitatively, we're pretty confident that we're right.
All right, everybody, we are right at time. Becky, this was wonderful. Thank
Pleasure.
you so much
Pleasure.
for your
Yes.
talk.
Please have conversations with each other about how you're doing.
Yes, we will. Thank you.
Thank you, online folks. Should I click the leave button?